Welcome to Race Talks. We're excited that you're here tonight. Our topic is how to really be a white ally, stories from the Civil Rights era. And we have three pioneers, veterans from the Civil Rights movement. How many of you got to see Selma this year, the past year? I bet you thought the Civil Rights movement was this last year. No, it was in 2013. 2013. Now this year is the 50th anniversary for the Black Panthers, so they gave the Civil Rights movement two years, and then they started. At the end of the evening, we'll have a drawing for people who get to know each other. Now, normally we say get to know somebody who's of a different ethnicity and that you don't know. Tonight, the requirement is somebody you don't know. So that was funny, y'all. Because if you looked around the room, you noticed everybody here is mostly white. So we're not making you pick somebody from a different ethnicity tonight. Just pick someone you don't know. Now, there is a stipulation. You do have to go spend that. It's a $25 gift certificate. And you do need to go do it. I spoke to someone the other night. She had won on 2 occasions, and both times she had won, the person said, oh, never mind, I don't want to go. And, you know, that's really, she was a pretty good sport about it, but that's hurtful. You don't want people doing that. The whole idea here is for us to get to know each other as human beings. Because if you say, I'm working on diversity, I'm a pioneer, I'm an ally, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, but you don't have people who come into your home that you're friends with, then your kids aren't going to learn to accept the rest of the world. You are doing lip service. You are not really a person who's in favor of diversity. So, walk the talk. Get to know people who don't look like you. Invite them into your home. Be friends with them. You'd be amazed what can happen. You might have a good time. And besides, some of my best friends are white folks. And I even married a white person, I mean, you know. But just to be safe, I married a brother too. So I'm not prejudiced at all. And who knows what number 3 is going to be, okay? So, you know, we just keep it moving. All right. On the tables are bios. We're not trying to bore you to death. And so read the bios. Anthony, you want to pick one up, show it to everybody what it looks like, the little plastic thing. On the ends of the tables, there's a bio too. These people are very interesting. And with that, I will sit down and let them take over.
Is that on?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Karen, hold it like this.
Okay. So my name is Karen Haberman Trusty.
Louder.
Louder?
Yeah.
Is that better? Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Okay, she started.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I was lucky enough to be in the Civil Rights Movement back in the day. And I'm going to tell you my most dramatic story. And then we'll go from there. It's a killer, almost. And I do use the N-word in this story. And I want to say that the way the N-word is used in this story is the way it's been used in history. As a word of violence, as a word of prejudice and hate. And so when you hear this word, that's what it has always meant. That's what people, when white people have used that word, it has been a word of violence. Okay, so this is 1964 in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was working with a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at the time, which was even Martin Luther King, my hand's shaking. I don't know what to do about that. Okay. Even Martin Luther King called us the shock troops of the movement. SNCC was a young organization that was really radical and really would go anywhere and stand up. They're the ones that did the primary work in the deep, deep South, in Mississippi, in Georgia, in Alabama, to break the back of the violent segregation that was happening in the 60s. Now, there had been a movement before that, but this became an out front movement. And primarily, SNCC was of young people. They actually hired 16 and 17-year-old from Mississippi to be on their field staff. There are not a lot of places that would do that, even today. But that's because they really believed in bringing the real people into the fold and making them part of the organization and part of the decision making. So it's July 4th, 1964. About 40 years later, I realized that that was the day that the Civil Rights Bill became enacted. And I and three other African Americans, went to this rally. And this rally was advertised. It was at Stone Mountain in Atlanta. Does anybody know where Stone Mountain is? Okay. They used to have Klan meetings up there. I didn't know this, of course, but we went to this rally that was in the public domain. They were advertising it all over the radio. And it was a rally where George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, excuse me, and Ross Barnett, the former governor of Mississippi, were speaking. And it turned out it was basically a Klan rally. And the four of us walked in. There were people behind me that didn't know what was going to happen. And the guy behind me, his brother was in front of me. And he said, when I saw what was happening, I didn't think my mother should lose 2 sons today. So I turned around and went the other way. We walked into the stadium. There were 10,000 ardent segregationists in this rally. It was in a big stadium-like thing. And all of a sudden, it got completely quiet. And all of a sudden, a large white woman stood on a chair and yelled, "Kill the niggers!" And the whole place went ballistic. I was the 4th person in, and I mean, it was crazy. It was like being in a beehive. It was so scary. And I'm like, people were picking up metal chairs, the kind that fold, and they started hitting us with them. And in my nonviolent training, because I had worked with SNCC before, and I'd been in jail in Atlanta demonstrating against segregation, and so I knew this. They sort of train you what to do when you're being attacked. And the thing that you do is you go like this to cover your organs and protect your vulnerable parts. And then they also say, if you have glasses, take off your glasses. Well, I've had glasses since I was 6. I can't see a bloody thing without my glasses. And so I took off my glasses. And I remembered this, you know, I just went on to automatic. And I remember taking off my glasses and saying, well, this is it. I mean, there was no way I was getting out of there. And I took my glasses off and I crouched down, and people were yelling. I mean, the hatred, you could have gone like this and the whole place would have, it was so much hate. And so all of a sudden this white guy puts his arm around my shoulder and says, "Get out of here." And he leads me out. And he's yelling at the other people beating on me. He says, "Act like white men, act like white men." Turns out he was a segregationist too, but he didn't believe in violence. And he actually was turned off and went home and stopped joining the White Citizens Council because he was so upset by the amount of violence. And so he led me out of there, and then he went back in and pulled people off, the black guys that were getting beaten up. One guy, Matthews Jones, who was a freedom singer with SNCC, had 16 stitches in his head. The other guys used chairs as a shield and sort of fenced off the blows. And then they went out the other way. And I remember coming out, I hardly remember any of this. I was so scared. And I remember coming out and feeling the sun on my face and going, I guess I'm alive. And my joke is, you know, God just didn't want me to die that day because by any reasonable estimation, I should have, you know, all of us should have been done in. So that's my it's a hard story for me to tell because I still have some post-traumatic stress from it. And I start trembling. But people have asked me if I was crazy to do this. Were we all crazy to go into the Deep South? Maybe. I mean, we were willing to put our lives on the line, and that's not why I went. I really didn't understand how much of a clam rally it was, to be honest. But I do know that my father heard about it in New York on the radio. It got a lot of press. I don't know whether any of those pictures have come up, but one of them says, Long Island girl saved from mob, and you know, it got... The question is, when you do nonviolence, what are you showing? If that action hadn't happened, what would have happened was they would have had this big 4th of July rally acting like it was a barbecue, acting like it was nothing. And what it really was a gathering of people full of hate. And it showed that. And it shocked Atlanta that that thing happened. And Atlanta was trying to be, they were segregated, but they were trying to be nice segregated. And it showed that that wasn't the case. And so it's very important, these actions. And that's the same thing that happened later on. Part of what I want to talk about today is how the current movement of Black Lives Matter, can people still hear me? Yeah. Okay. Of Black Lives Matter has, from my perspective, has a lot of roots right back into the civil rights movement. When I first heard about Ferguson and Michael Brown, I got really despondent and really upset. And all I could think of was, is this what we fought for? Is this what's happened? And then I remembered that in Freedom Summer, do people know what Freedom Summer is? Okay, well, for those of you who don't, Freedom Summer was an action that SNCC did. They were organizing in Mississippi. It took place in Mississippi. And they'd been organizing in Mississippi for 3 years, gradually getting embedded in the community and building grassroots enclaves and working toward voter registration. But the trouble is, every time that somebody came out as a leader, they ended up getting killed or run out of town. It was very dangerous work. And finally, when there were more people killed, Herbert Lee, Lewis Allen, it was like, we have to do something different. We're going to develop 900 leaders and 859 of them are going to get shot. Because there was nobody accountable there. It was basically pretty much a police state. And so they decided to have volunteers come from all over America. They got almost 1,000 volunteers to come and work in Mississippi. Most of them were white. Most of them were college students. They recruited actively in, quote, important colleges. That wasn't all that they took. There were some people who showed up that was their calling. But they did that in order to get the country to notice, for God's sake. Get the country to notice. And so what this shows to me is that the country, and I'm speaking of, when I say the country, which is sort of not good the way I use it, but I'm mostly speaking about white people, the people that were running the country at the time, and that they didn't notice, they didn't give a damn whether people were killed, black people were killed in Mississippi. But when white volunteers were in the community, they started noticing. And so one of the things that happened was, the 7 days into the project, two volunteers and one staff, well, 2 staff people and 1 volunteer disappeared. It was June 21st, 1964. One guy, a white guy from New York, Andy Goodman, he'd been in Mississippi for 24 hours. They disappeared. They were turned over by the sheriff of the county, Neshoba County, and 43 days later, They were dug out of an earthen dam, dead. They'd been killed. Now, the thing about this that I feel really relates, it's a terrible story, but what happened was, once they disappeared, everybody cared. It was like the whole world was worried about where these guys were. Now, one of the guys was James Chaney, who is a local, young, black Mississippian. The other two guys were from New York, white. Why did the whole world care? Because two white guys has disappeared. And I'm using this to make a point. Because the point is at that time in this country, even more than today, it was only white lives that mattered. Truly, it was only white lives that mattered, except for just a few people. But the country as a whole, the white people, just didn't have any consciousness about this stuff. So let's fast forward to me hearing about Michael Brown getting shot in Ferguson and saying, my God, 3 minutes? Oh my, okay. Saying, my God, you know, this is bad. And I'm sitting there and I'm realizing it took 50 years for somebody to hold a sign up that said Black Lives Matter. It took 50 years to go from what happened in Freedom Summer to what is happening now. I cherish this movement. I know it's a rocky road, but as white people, we need to try to understand that the experience of African Americans in this country has been really different than our experience, most of our experience. You can't, you know, all of us, I mean, anyway, it can't be 100%, but most of us, most white people have not experienced a terrible fear of the police and that they're dangerous and that they might kill you on the spot and that they're supporting the most racist laws going. I experienced that. I was terrified in Mississippi. I also had a great time too, so it wasn't just terror. The mass meetings, I would still go to Mississippi for the mass meetings, which was a large gathering that we did, and when you walked out of there, you were singing your heart out, and you could face a tank. But most white people haven't had that experience. And so when I hear that a black man has run from a policeman, I go, I'd be running too. I still have that visceral experience. This is not about not liking cops. It's about the experience that you've had and how much fear and thinking you might die from this person. And so I think some white people, when they see somebody running from a policeman, they say, oh, what'd he do? What? He must have done something wrong. Maybe he's a thug. Oh, I hate that word. Anyway, but because they don't understand what the experience has been and how the history has been, that by and large, the police and the state have been holding, at least in history, segregation and the laws that are holding black people down rather than supporting their liberation. And again, this is really broad-stroked. I don't hate police most of the time. You know, but it's really important that we understand that our experience is different, because if we don't understand that, we project our own experience on what's happening and assume that if I were running from the police, it would mean I'd feel guilty rather than I'm scared. And so please, I ask you, and also learn a little history, because in the history is a lot of why people of color have the feelings that they do. Because they've sat around, in Mississippi, they sat around and talked about the uncle who got lynched, and the person who got run out of town, and the cousin who you know, had to escape in the middle of the night. And so it's really important that you try to be empathetic and put your own experience aside and try stepping in the shoes, okay? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. My name's Chuck Lytle. I'm a native of Pennsylvania, been in Oregon since 1971. In March of 1965, I was a freshman at a small liberal arts college affiliated with the Church of the Brethren in deepest Pennsylvania, the howling wilderness of Pennsylvania, believe it or not. The school had 800 students in it, compulsory chapel, coat and tie. And then, in our own little world, next happened. Okay, this happened. What is this? This is a clip from Time magazine back in 1965. This is the melee at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the prelude to the march from Selma to Montgomery. Okay, this was all over the news. Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, everybody. Okay, front page of Time magazine. This magazine issue right here actually had MLK on the cover. Okay, this hit my school like a ton of bricks. Why? Who's to say? Human nature, okay? This really, really affected this school in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. We had two spark plugs, a senior black woman by the name of Harriet Richardson, who later became Undersecretary of HUD in the Jimmy Carter administration, and a poet, an academic poet they called him, Galway Cannell, who had just finished a poet in residency at Reed College right here in Oregon, in Portland. And the two of them were just incensed. And they rallied the students, and lo and behold, with an administration fighting us all the way, okay, a whole group of us, about 12, took off, okay, for a general call from both SCLC, that's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, okay, to bear witness of what was going on down in Selma, okay, to bear witness about that. Next slide, please. This is another page from the same magazine, and these are these wonderful political cartoons. They were famous at the time. I don't know how many people have seen them. Herblock is in there and a bunch. The one of them I like is all the way down at the bottom. It shows George Wallace leading what look to be apes, and he says, "That's it, don't let them make a mockery of our laws." And he's leashing, and you see the horses with the people back there. You'll see why that's pertinent in a second. Next slide. Okay, so in preparation for the trip, we had actually a couple of veterans from the school, believe it or not. One of the women, who was an adjunct professor, both at my school and at Penn State, at this time had both of her sons in jail in in Mississippi. And her daughter was one of my classmates, and she was in a total panic. I mean, all hell was breaking loose down in the South, and here come these students with coat and ties and everything, and you know, with their Bibles literally, and we're going down south. So she had us do this. This is an old mimeograph. You remember the Mimeo things that smelled like alcohol? And we printed these up and cut them out, and we scotch tape a dime to the back of them and put them in our shoe. These are the emergency numbers. You know, you get one call. So that was how we armed ourselves. No guns, no swords, you know, nothing like that. A dime in our shoe with emergency phone numbers. So away we went. Next slide. And here's where we ended up. On the left is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Everybody know who that, whose church that is? Martin Luther King's church in Montgomery. And what they did is that somehow the word got down to the organizers in Selma itself, and they said a flood of people are coming. And so what they did is they waved us off into Montgomery. They didn't know what to do with us. So what they did, since we were the second group to show up, second in the whole country, they sent us to this church. And we went in for the church service. Now, can somebody tell me a little bit of irony about that church program on the right?
Yeah.
I think what the deal is that that's all that was available from the church supplier. I mean, that was basically it. But bless their souls, they took up a collection and they collected 50 bucks for us, which we finally gave to the guy that was running the Freedom House in Montgomery. And here's what happened to us. Welcome to Montgomery. Yes, this was the welcoming committee. What this is about 200, they called them euphemistically deputies. These are basically thugs, okay? And what we were trying to do is we had the original, I would have loved to have seen it, but I didn't, a petition to Governor George Wallace to issue a permit for the march from Selma to Montgomery. And we started at the Alabama State Teachers Colleges, which at that time was, okay, I'm not politically correct here. They used to call them black colleges. Now it's like, what are they? There's a name for them.
Historically.
Thank you, historically black college. And so we were going from that college to the State House. Well, George Wallace had other ideas, and this was his idea. And we walked right into this. Now remember, this is the week before Selma. This is the week before the movie. We were down there prepared to go for the march. We were there for the march. We wanted to go all the way from Selma to Montgomery. We got waved off. And for historical correctness, the first college group to show up was from Oberlin College. How many people here know about Oberlin? Thank you. I mean, it doesn't exist. Do we have alums? Do we have alums?
My sister went there.
Yeah, it doesn't exist anymore, more's the pity. But they were already there drinking wine Spadoti, look that up in Wikipedia, and they had a shortwave antenna on the roof, and they were monitoring the police calls. And the Klan was on the same wavelength, and which is also fascinating because the way they would talk is the police, the Klan would say, okay, we're going to such and such avenue and such, and the police had said, okay, give us a call when you're done, and then we'll come and clean up the mess. And that's how they operated, literally. And we're listening to this on the, on the shortwave. So again, next slide, please. Some more details of what happened to us. Somewhere, next slide, press enter. Red arrow. Who is that? Who do you think that is? Why do you think I put that slide up there? That's me. Look at the way I'm dressed. Right out of an 800 student church school in Pennsylvania. I've got a white shirt and a tie on. I mean, we must have stuck out like so well we did, of course. We talked funny to them down there. And this is what was going on, and that's why I wanted to show that cartoon earlier. You see the horses up there. I mean, they were just waylaying on everybody. Next slide, please. Yes, and a number of times, I don't talk about this much. So, I mean, I got to give credit to Donna Maxey to putting the pressure on to get me here, because I really haven't talked about this much. But one of the criticisms we got is that, why didn't you go to the march? It was only a week later. Well, first of all, we didn't know that. And this is the condition we were in. I'm sorry. We weren't marching anywhere except maybe out of the hospital. The girl on the far right is Pam Clemson, a classmate of mine. She's the one who's got two brothers already in jail in Philadelphia, Mississippi, I believe, at this time. She ended up in jail because she got so mad at the cop that blasted that kid and knocked him just like crazy. I mean, he ended up in the hospital. They corralled her, too. So we learned the lesson. If somebody's on a horse with a cane, don't give them lip, okay? And Pam Clemson ended up in the slammer. We had to bail her out. Next slide, please. Okay, here are the two organizers of all this from my college. The person on the left, he just died last year. He had a wonderful obit in the New York Times, and I urge you to read it. It's really a great obit. His name is Galway Connell, an incredible poet. And he was in residence in my college. The woman on the right, and I will confess, I mean, the guy who took the picture didn't get a Nobel Prize or a Pulitzer Prize for nothing. They were an item in our school. You imagine how that went down with the Church of the Brethren. And that's Harriet Richardson. And she now runs a fund involving, I think, housing for blacks in New York City. Supreme activist. Amazing, amazing woman. That made Life magazine. And the good Church of the Brethren people back in Pennsylvania just had like 10 heart attacks, cats and kittens, when they saw that in Life magazine. Next slide. Okay. And we had a reunion in 2005, the 40th reunion. And somebody who was doing a PhD thesis at Penn State was writing about civil rights activities, and she called me at work, and I kept correcting her. I say, no, you're wrong. And she finally, in exasperation, says, how the hell do you know all of this? It's details. This was 40-some years ago. And I said, I wrote it down on site. What this is a handwritten journal that I kept down south the whole time. Literally, I have pages that were written on the curb in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, here's your test, okay? There's a very famous video clip of James Farmer. Everybody know who he was? He was the head of Congress of Racial Equality. And it's this great thing, he's in bib overalls, and he's sweeping up orange peels around the feet of this tax squad that's got the street block. Well, I was sitting on the curb right at the end, writing in this journal. Basically, it's all in there. I don't know how I could write that fast, but I did. And I still have it. So I've got this narrative of all of this mealy stuff from the whole, what is that? How many years ago is that? 50. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that was media, that was television, that was Life magazine. That was just like awful public relations for my school, which at that time was very, very conservative. So we organized on campus. We organized locally. There were black communities in these small industrial towns in Pennsylvania. And so we organized. We had a student group called SCORE, Student Committee for Racial Equality. Next year we decided to do more. And we signed up with SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and what they were doing, and I have to read this, I'm sorry, everybody needs a prompter. And what we did is we worked on something called the Summer Community Organization and Political Education Project, SCOPE, for SCLC. And so away we went. This time we made it to Selma. And we were working on the auspices of a woman called Shirley Mesher. She's still active. She's a community activist up in Seattle. You can Google her and read about her work right now. And she was running the SCLC office, and she was involved in voter registration. And I'll tell you about this book in here, is that during that summer, not us, not our group, but everybody combined, we registered 11,000 black people in the rurals in Alabama. 11,000. And you can read about it here. Okay, so away we go. Oh, 5 minutes, God help me. Okay, here are some flyers. I have never seen these anywhere. And I'm sure somebody at the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham will go, hey, well, we got that covered. But these were in the SCLC office down in Selma, and I just really, really like them. And I wanted to show these to you so you can get a flavor. Because Karen mentioned something, is that, believe it or not, in the midst of all of this, murders, beatings up, shootings, everything, there's an incredible amount of humor. And I think the reason was is if we wouldn't have laughed, we would have cried, basically. I am dead serious. I mean, it's what kept us going back, literally. Because we would go out to do voter registration 1 hour after sunrise. We had to be back in the SCLC offices by an hour before sunset. You can figure out why. Those were absolute inviolate rules. You had to be out of the rules before it was dark, bottom line. Okay, so I wanted to show you this. There's another one, keep going. I love this one. And I showed this because this, to me, in my experience, I can only speak for me, was the spirit of the blacks who was working with and around us in the rurals and what they call the black belt down south. Irrepressible. And I mean, this is something I will always remember. I mean, you could not keep this person down. I'm sorry, you couldn't. There was no way. And that's why I wanted to show it to you. Next slide, please. And here is, well, Karen can speak to this one. There he is, defending something, God knows what. Next slide. Okay, now it's my story time. What does that look like? That is a Black Panther. We were out, there was a bunch of us, we were coming back from the rurals. We were in the chicken shack. Every southern town has a chicken shack. It's in the black section. You know what the black section is. No street lights, no sidewalks, no paving. And there was a chicken shack, and in walks this guy with a Howard sweatshirt and an afro, the first one I'd seen. He sat down, put a quart mason jar of some godforsaken green thing, look at that grass in it growing, and he says, I hear you boys have been out in the rurals. And he says, I want you to have one on me. It was silage drippings. How many people here have drunk silage drippings? Oh, it had to be you. That's my wife. I don't even get, okay, I can ask this one. Have you ever gotten drunk on silage drippings? Because we sure did. And he was trying to explain who he was and what he was doing. That's a Black Panther, okay? And he drew that on a bar napkin for me, so he could sort of explain what's going on. God bless his soul. I mean, Stokely Carmichael met and talked with him, I don't know how many times, an amazing guy. Next slide. This, Stokely said, caused more hell, raised more hell in the whites in Alabama than anything he ever did. Look at the two pictures. That's the side and the obverse side of a flyer that he had printed up, and he scattered them everywhere. In Lowndes County, Tyler County, anywhere down there. And when the white power structure saw that slip of paper, they went nuts. He was very proud of that. And it was quite a game changer. Next slide, please. I'll try to get through. There's the Panther. Trust me. I know someone's going to argue with me. The first Black Panther was thought up by Stokely Carmichael for the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, and he did it because look at the white supremacy for the right. The Democratic Party of Alabama, their symbol was a white chicken. And Stokely Carmichael goes, for God's sake, a white chicken? We can come up with something better than that. And they came up with a Black Panther. Wow. How's that for chutzpah, huh? Next slide. Now, what was Stokely doing? Now remember, I'm working for SCLC. Okay, I have to explain what's going on. Stokely had gotten bombed out so many times in Lowndes County that the SNCC people in Selma felt sorry for him and gave him a little tiny back storage room in their offices, which were right above the SCLC offices in Selma, which was right across the street from the police station and the jail, by the way. And so when we were done with our voter registration, I mean, come on, we were 19 years old. SCLC, yes, cool, but they were all suits. They were dealing with, high up federal people and whatnot. We go upstairs to SNCC, they weren't radical enough. Sorry, Karen. And we went back to talk to Stokely because Stokely had the fire, and that's the best I can describe it. Stokely had the fire. Oh, boy, did he ever. But what he was doing, look at what's in the squares there. You couldn't get any down into the roots in the grass than Stokely Carmichael doing grassroots. Look at what he's doing. He's telling people, what is a vote? What is it? How do you vote? What does it do? We're talking, he's at the bottom. This is the ultimate education. This is not a 30,000-foot flyover. He was in it, as deep as you possibly get. This guy just totally blew me away. Next slide. I know. I had to do this. I was young. I was foolish. Is anybody not foolish when they're young? When we worked for SCLC, they gave us a button. It's the one on the left. Okay. We're talking, oh God, the philosophers and Gandhi and all that and whatnot. And there's Stokely throwing it in the face of the white power structure. That was his philosophy. He gave me that button on the right. He gave that to me. It's like the side, and I'm being very egotistical here. I saw a truck once on I-5, and it showed a ceremonial sword in a Marine, and it says, earned, never given. That's my button. Sorry, I had to do that. One more slide. Okay, we were down there for the first anniversary of the march. Didn't make the march. We made the first anniversary. This was incredible. Got a chance to go one-on-one with Julian Bond, Dick Gregory. What an amazing guy. He's still alive, isn't he? And John Lewis was there. It was an amazing time, and Stokely too. And this is the flyer for it. And finally, here I am. The red arrow was me. That's my little brother. That's Junior out of college. Full disclosure, that's right. That's where we did all this stuff. Notice the wild American Madras sport coat. When's the last time you've seen one of those? But what the red arrow shows was the Black Panther button. I got a lot of crap for wearing that at college, and I just looked him in the eye and said, well, tough shit. I'm sorry. So there it is. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I highly recommend you take it home, go to PALS, carry it on. Carry it on. It talks about all the politics in the Black Belt in the 60s. It's an academic work. I have many conversations with the author, Susan Youngblood Ashmore. It's comprehensive, it's thorough, it lays out all the politics. And if you're into the gore, which aren't we all, here's Powerful Days. You can buy this at PALS. This is all the famous photographs from the Civil Rights Movement. This guy won a Pulitzer Prize for this. A lot of the pictures you see up there from him, I highly recommend it. The text on this book is by Andrew Young. Thank you very much.
I'm going to stand over there, stand here. Well, can you hear me? I'm going to take a little different approach. I was involved too, and in many ways I was a volunteer marshal on the March of Washington. I was up almost in the front row when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. I see in every city a tribute to Martin Luther King.
Yeah, hold it like a rock star.
Okay, I'm a rock star now. You see the statue of Martin Luther King, but I want you to know there were hundreds of thousands of people. We name an avenue after him and he deserves it. But there were hundreds of thousands, maybe more, of people behind him and in the movement, people that took risk, people that risked their lives, people that gave up what they had, people who braved beatings. You've heard some of it. I was in 1964, as I was at March in Washington, a trial lawyer with the U.S. Department of Justice, and I was in the Bobby Kennedy's organized crime section. The three civil rights workers with Summer Project, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, two young Jewish men from New York, one black man, young black man, is from Alabama, I thought. But I don't know. In any event, we're organizing for Freedom Summer, and they were at the Mount Zion Methodist Church in Neshoba County, and that's outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Neshoba County was ruled by Sheriff Rainey. The sheriffs of Mississippi at that time, and particularly Sheriff Rainey, ran on the platform that I can keep the Negroes in their place. And that was the political motto of the day. You have to understand that Mississippi was so very different than it is today. The three of them were organizing at Mount Zion Church with the church elders. The church elders had agreed to allow their church to be used for a freedom school to teach people how to register to vote and to encourage them to do so. And one night, after the three were not there and the church elders were meeting, the elders saw flashing lights, the headlights in the parking lot, and a few minutes later, a bunch of toughs wielding baseball bats and other weapons, and one man in uniform in the back, in the rear, sheriff's uniform, came in, started yelling, "Where are the NACPers? Where are the NACPers?" And started beating them up, and they couldn't find any NACPers, and they told them, "Get the hell out of here," and beat them up as they went out the door, including Bud Cole, who was the president of the church at that time, whose jaw was broken. And they all ran home, and as they ran toward their homes in the countryside, after a while they saw behind them light, and it was the flames as the church was burnt. This is the true story of the movie Mississippi is Burning, which was fiction. But there were different numbers that you read about, but something like 80 arsons of churches and other places where meetings were thought to be held in Mississippi and Alabama that summer. And when the FBI finally got into it, getting ahead of my story, they didn't know what to call it. They couldn't call it the Jones case, the Smith case, because they didn't know who did it yet, and they called it the Mississippi Burning case. And that's how the movie got named. That's where the phrase came from. In any event, J. Edgar Hoover could no longer resist the pressure from Bobby Kennedy and LBJ to get into the civil rights business and to investigate and prosecute civil rights crimes. Because, as was described to you by Karen, the public fever about where are these white young men was so great that they had to do something, and I will tell you, to the credit of the FBI, they sent in their very best, and they really did a job. The FBI investigation hit a blank wall. They found the bodies, but nobody would talk. They couldn't make the case. Well, with the FBI, if you don't make your case, you're in trouble, at least in J. Edgar Hoover's day. So they decided to use a tactic of the organized crime section, which was to call a grand jury and get a few indictments on smaller matters and question everybody and make it look like we have the case in the bag, because that would loosen tongues, it would make people nervous. And the problem was that the Civil Rights Division didn't have anybody experienced in handling grand juries and preparing for grand juries. And so they asked our section for somebody. And when I heard that, I rushed to get that assignment, and I got it. I was the old man of the group, the old hand. I was 29. We worked for John Doerr, whose name some of you may remember, a great American in the Civil Rights Movement.
Totally.
Yes. I had a couple weeks to prepare. All I really learned was the FBI had run into a blank wall. We came down to Mississippi, the team of us, there were either 6 or 7. And we drove in our rented Fords down the highway and then turned off on a country road and drove down the country road, red clay. And I want to describe the scene to you because I want to talk to the people, talk about the people there and what they did and the courage they showed and how they lived. It was rolling hills. It was on, I think, August. No, it was in July. Rolling hills, cotton puffs on green plants, red clay earth, dust in the air, red. And it was actually beautiful. It was beautiful. And every here and there was an unpainted, weathered shack. 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, maybe a porch, maybe electricity. If there was a porch, there was a rocking chair. And elsewhere, cotton everywhere. Today it's not cotton. It was a cotton economy. The South was based on cheap labor. Slavery was a system of cheap labor.
Free labor.
There are lessons from history, one of which is what happens to an economy based on wealthy people with cheap labor. We went to this field that was, I don't know, say from here to that post square with me, and it was empty. There was a little turnaround. There was cinders, embers. There was ash. There was a little staircase, apparently went up to the front door or something, out of cement, standing there like a tombstone. I'll never forget it. And we stood around it for a moment. And Bob Owen, who was the leader of the Civil Rights Group, he was actually 2 years older than me, stood at the head in the semicircle, and he turned to me and he said, "This is our shrine." It was the Mount Zion Church, what was left of it. He told me that whenever they came down, they stopped first at the church because it renewed their commitment. As we stood there, you could feel commitment flowing into you. We had to make a case. We had to. And then we drove away down the clay road, and coming in from a side clay road was a wagon, maybe 20, 25 feet long, drawn by a horse. And on it was a stack of the burlap bags that cotton pickers drag on their shoulder. They pick a piece of cotton, put it in the bag, and drag it down. And at the end of the day, it goes on a cart, and they all go to the gin to measure out the cotton they'd picked and how much their wages were, their sharecropper wages. were for that day. And there were men, there were women, there were little kids. The women had bandanas, I remember. The little kids, a lot of them had bandanas. And they were singing songs, and I don't know if they were spirituals or work songs or what they were. But we followed the cart for a little ways, and then another cart pulled in from another field. And I was thinking, my God, this is the 20th century. But you wouldn't know it from the 19th or maybe the 18th. And it was true, because slavery was over. And after Reconstruction, all the elements of slavery were reconstituted with Jim Crow laws and the social economic relationships and the political powerlessness of the black people were the same as under slavery, except they couldn't be sold, bought, sold, but they could be dispossessed, they could be fired, they could be disciplined. It was another century. Well, we talked to those people, the sharecroppers. Few had a few acres of their own, in addition to the sharecropping. I went first to Bud Cole's home. And Bud Cole invited me in. We knew that one thing we had to do was gain their confidence. And I didn't really plan it, but I put out my hand. I'm Jake Tanzer. I'm with the Department of Justice. And I'm happy to meet you, Mr. Cole. Well, he'd never shaken a white man's hand. He'd never been called Mr. Cole by a white man. It hit me afterward. I was just acting naturally. But he told me the story, and Mrs. Cole, Beatrice Cole, sat in a chair, hands across her bosom, nodding, yes, yes, yes. And finally, at the end of it, I said, Mr. Cole, can you testify about this to a grand jury? And he said, yes. Very quiet, dignified man, tall, like I am. Gray-haired, like I'm not. He said, yes. And I said, are you sure? Can you look 23 white people in the eye and tell them this story about the violence the white men did to you? And he said, yes. And I said, why? What makes you so sure? Why can you do it? And he said, I remember his words. All them boys tried to do was to help us. And Mrs. Cole nodded. And I talked to others, same way. The next place we went at night, there was no electricity, knocked on the door. One-room shack. The man opened the door. The whole family, 2 little kids, wife and husband, were in one double bed, sleeping. They had no electricity for light. But I could see on the side a black sheet going up the wall at a diagonal, rustling. What kind of a black sheet? And I realized they were roaches. Poverty. Dirt floors. It was terrible. But one after another, yes, I'll testify. Those boys didn't do nothing bad. One after another. I'm cutting a couple hours down to 15 minutes. They did. And they were credible. I met one man, incidentally, waiting for his great-grandchildren, who I wanted to talk to. And he was 105 years old. This was in 1964. He was born a slave. He remembered his father being sold down the river. He remembered his mother's grief. This was still not yet oral history, this was memory. And it was what was told around the dinner tables of that time and place. Okay, my time's about up. I will tell you, we brought back the first civil rights conspiracy indictments in history. And ultimately they were convicted. And that could be a whole story too. I would like to tell one short story about another event. I returned after I left the government in 1967 as a volunteer civil rights lawyer for a month with an organization called the Lawyers Committee, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. There were more volunteers that went down with that organization founded by the ABA at John Kennedy's request than any other state in the Union, not by population, regardless of population. 23 of us over a period of time, over a period of years, few years. And the interesting thing was that it wasn't just us way out left-wing Jewish liberals that did it. It was harsh conservatives, lawyers, way, way over on the right. The lawyers of Oregon, like others, were outraged that people would be treated this way. Outraged at the nature of segregation. Outraged that they couldn't get a cup of coffee at the drugstore. Outraged that they couldn't get decent wages. And they went down as volunteers. And it's something for at least the Oregon bar to be proud of, because they did a wonderful job. It was later headed by one of my law school mates from the University of Oregon Law School. When you next see the statue of Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C., or travel Martin Luther King Boulevard in Portland or any other city, think fondly of Martin Luther King, a great American who deserves all his honor. But remember, too, Bud and Beatrice Cole and the courage they showed. A few months before I went down there, a few months before the killing of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, there was a black man in Greenville, Mississippi, who went to the courthouse and asked for an application to vote. He didn't even fill it out and leave it. He just asked for it so he could go home, study it, prepare it. And by evening, he'd been shotgunned to death. That is the kind of courage these people showed. And I hope they are never forgotten. I didn't bring my book, but there is a book called We Are Not Afraid that gives this history and its context and its background and tells every detail. We Are Not Afraid. I forget the name of the author. The title comes from the second verse of We Shall Overcome. We are not afraid, etc. Remember those people.
Let's hear it again. I think these people deserve a standing ovation. Okay, I'm going to see if I can do this and not be emotional. Okay. If you have any questions, we're going to take questions for about 10 minutes. And we will have discussion tonight. And McMenamins, we're going to go over 9 o'clock, about 15 minutes, because the sound system didn't work. And that wasn't my fault. So, anyway, are there any questions from the audience? And if you have a question, come up here to this side. Make your question very short, and don't ask a comprehensive question. Just ask something real quick.
I'll try to fit the guidelines. So you guys mentioned briefly a little bit about the poverty you saw. Do you guys see anything with today's levels of poverty, post-recession, non-recovery, that's also kind of influencing and impacting the civil rights movement that's happening now?
with?
Well, I think poverty, you know, breeds disempowerment and terrible conditions and what's to me what's happened, one of the downsides of the civil rights movement has been integration, because in a way it's broken up the black community. In the old days, the black community was circular in itself. So a lawyer lived next to a steel worker, lived next to a maid, lived next to, the whole community was together. It's now been broken up. The cream goes to a better school, the historical black colleges are having a terrible time, but poverty in itself, whether it's white or black, I spent 10 years in Appalachia after working with SNCC because they mandated us to go work with poor whites and try to help, try to organize them. It was very difficult. But, you know, poverty is erosive and it's corrosive. And so I feel like, and it's also sort of the way what happens in the really poor neighborhoods like Ferguson. I mean, it's a perfect example. In Ferguson, I don't know how many of you know this, but black big people had been profiled and targeted and stopped for every little damn thing. Jaywalking, a taillight, you name it. And then they were fined. And then they were, when they couldn't pay the fines because they were poor, their fines were doubled. Some of them went to jail for these damn fines. When the Justice Department went in and looked at it, they discovered that the white power structure was basically living off the fines, mostly, predominantly in the black and people of color community. So I don't know whether this is answering your question, but it becomes this whole system of poverty and race and control and taking advantage of. That's how I see it. Did you want to try that one?
Yeah, if I could say a word, I've been back down to Mississippi several times. Reason, my wife's mother's family comes from there. And so we visited her family. And believe me, the first time I went, she brought me along. They really walked on eggs. So. But she comes from Covington County, her family does, my mother-in-law. There's a book out called The State of Jones. Covington County and Jones County seceded from the Confederacy during the Civil War, and they were led by a fellow named Newt Knight, who married one of his father's slave women. There are today the White Knights of Mississippi and the Black Knights of Mississippi. My wife is a White Knight. But in any event, the surroundings of the Mount Zion church community, for example, are in little brick cottages that were built by the Social Service Administration. I do not know the economic kind of information you were asking. But I do know that if you went to a 7-Eleven, you would see a white customer and a black clerk looking each other in the eye, which didn't happen back then. Black people didn't look white people in the eye to talk to them. You see them kind of joking around, you know, speaking good-naturedly to each other. You see them acting well. When I returned in '67, I went to lunch at the Sheraton, and sure enough, there's a middle-class, coat and tie, black man having lunch with white colleagues. That wouldn't have happened in '64, but the Civil Rights Act of '65 made that happen. The church, Mount Zion Community Church, was rebuilt in the later '60s. Some churches were rebuilt the very next summer by another student organization. And there was the circular drive-in that I mentioned. It was covered with gravel, and Mr. Cole took me out to see the church. And he said, well, Commissioner Jones, County Commissioner, sent out a load of gravel for the church. And I said, well, that was nice of him. And he said, well, in his way, it came a little late. But by then, the Civil Rights Act, the Voters' Rights Act of '67 was passed. And that's what really made the difference. So there is a lot of difference. What Karen says is surely true, but there is also a much less rigid, much more civil society.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with that
You've got
totally,
one more-
but we have not dealt with the economics, just like what you were talking about. Did you want to answer that? No? Okay.
And I will answer and say we have not dealt with the social injustice. As a black person, I will say that. Don't get me started. Okay. And we're not going to have time for the second question. We're just going to have time for one more. I mean, the third question. I don't know. They've got this wrapped around some kind of way. I don't know how you guys have this. There you go.
First of all, my hat's off to you as a member of...
Put this up close so they can hear you.
My hats are off to you as my fellow generation members and what you did and representing me and everyone else in your courage. On tonight's topic of how to be an ally, which I think is what this huge turnout is about, I'm going to ask something real specific. I'm standing in downtown Portland, May 25th, 2015, and it's not too rainy. And I observe the beginnings of what looks like mistreatment by the police, 2 or 3 policemen with a young black man who is unarmed, and I've seen no evidence of resistance in anything inappropriate, and I see the beginnings of something I think is wrong. Can you name 1 to 3 things that I can do standing there as a citizen, or also what should I avoid doing? But mostly, what do I do as an ally for that would be in service of the young black man?
Did everybody hear that?
Yes.
I now can answer that a little bit better because our son, who does something in high tech, I have no idea what it is, got me to buy an iPhone. And I was just before we started here teaching my wife how to take pictures with it and to take movies with it. I can only answer personally what I would do. Given my experience, I bet you my wife might back me up, I would not confront. I would stay away. I would film everything I possibly could. And if anybody was coming for me that had a uniform, I would disappear. And I mean, it's like Daniel Ellsberg. I'd find somebody other than anybody in the power structure to give that movie to. I don't know about the Oregonian. Probably Willamette Week would be a little better. Okay. But that's what I would do, and that's a very gut reaction sort of an answer for me, because you know I've been on the wrong end of nightsticks, as you've seen, and you know, and I know how that can escalate. You can be dead real fast, you know, which we all know. So that would be my first instinctive thing to do. It might not be right, it might not be the best thing, but that's what I would do. I'd film it. You know, back from my youth, the whole world is watching. The whole world is watching. That's probably a very powerful thing, I think, for any citizen to do. Anybody else?
So can each of you give one answer of what you think?
Oh, one answer?
Yeah.
To the question.
Because she wanted 2 or 3
Oh,
examples.
yeah.
Go ahead.
That's one.
Do you want to answer?
Okay, here we go.
Well, I actually had this outside of my mother's place down near PSU, and I did go up to the policeman, and yeah, nobody had drawn billy clubs or anything, but I saw this hostility. You know, you can sort of feel it, And I did go, and I said, you know, what's happening here? I didn't go in like pissed off or anything. And I asked the guy, the African American, are you all right? And you know, and basically sort of got in between it. It hadn't gotten to a violent place. I don't know what I would do if somebody were actually. I would certainly, I agree, take the camera out. The first thing is to take the camera out. I mean, just think what would not have happened if we hadn't had the videos that have been taken in the last few months. I mean, it's amazing. So that is the first thing. But I think as white people, they're less likely to beat us up.
Please say more. What are the words you use?
Okay. I would ask the person of color, are you all right? What's happening? And then I would say the same to the policeman. And nicely. I mean, you know, I have an edge for all that stuff. I mean, I could be really pissed off really fast. But just you know, just say, hey, well, you know, is everything all right? And what I noticed was, and then some other people came up, other white people came up and asked. And, you know, I think it's part of the consciousness that's changing in America. You know, for some white people, not all white people, but some white people are starting to get it.
You asked both of them.
I asked both of them.
The young man, is everything all right?
Right, and the policeman backed up, and I talked to the young man for a while. And so I couldn't tell whether it was going to go down the horrible road, but I felt like it was an intervention. I didn't feel really a danger. I felt nervous, but I didn't feel a danger, if that makes sense.
Well, I don't have a different answer than either of them gave. I would reaffirm them. I'm just holding the mic.
So something else you can do is get the officers' names. And if you can't get the officers' names, then you should get the number that's on the car. Because they are, you know, officers are assigned to certain cars, or the license number, so it can be tracked down to who it is. I had a situation where I was with a woman who works with youth, primarily of color, white woman, and she got a phone call from one of her students, and we went over and stood there while the police talked to him. And now here's what they will not tell you. If you are driving a car with tinted windows, that's a low rider, you're going to get pulled over. If it's a hoopty, if it's an older car, you're going to get pulled over. If you're going too slow, you're going to get pulled over. If you're going too fast, you're going to get pulled over. If you're leaning and driving, you're going to get pulled over. If you're black, most likely you're going to get pulled over. If you're Latino, good chance you're going to get pulled over. So what we did is we stood there and we asked the police, why is he being stopped? And why he got stopped was because they were driving down the street and he turned off after they got behind him in a block's time. So tell your friends, this is how to be a white ally, tell your friends of color that when the police are following them, let the police follow them for about 4 or 5 blocks. Because they're testing their, they're looking at their license plate to see if there's any outstanding warrants against them. And when they decide to turn, don't change your speed. When you decide to turn, start signaling almost a block ahead, supposed to be 100 feet, make sure you start 200, and then turn very slowly and just go on about your business, nothing's going on. And I tried to get the police to tell me that honestly. That particular day, the police did tell me those things. When I tried to get the higher-ups to tell me that, they wouldn't tell it. So those are some things that you can do. Stand there, and ask if it's okay. Now, that's in the case of being with the police. But most situations that you're going to have where you're an ally, and this is where our discussion groups come in. Do we have, how many facilitators do we have here? Okay. Facilitator Tom, can you go to one of the other tables because Karen's going to, oh, Barbara's there too. So Barbara was there. So Barbara, could you go to another table, and Karen's got another table. And so who doesn't have a facilitator? Raise your hand if you don't have a facilitator. So Barbara and Karen, you see those two back there? Okay. And you folks that are here, you need a facilitator. Is there somebody else who's an extra facilitator somewhere around? That can come, could you come up to be with this group? You gotta sit on the floor. But anyway, so you're at work, you're in your neighborhood, you're at the grocery store. We're not asking you to stop racist cops in the South in the 60s. We're just asking you to step up today and stop stuff that you see going on. Speak up. When you hear the jokes, my daughter is Jewish, happens to be Jewish. Somebody made a joke about a Jew fro. She said, wait a minute, that's not going to work. Step up, speak up. Don't let people be derogatory about any group. And this is the same thing with people of color. Step up, speak up, even if it's not your group. Step up, speak up. Jules Pfeiffer did a cartoon, and there's a poem called The Hangman. How many of you are familiar with The Hangman? It's about, they came for the Jews and I said nothing. You know which one I'm talking about? If you don't speak up, who's going to speak up for you? And let me tell you, the Bible is true. The sins of the father are visited upon the son. You might not speak up this time and you just don't know what's going to happen to your kids or your grandkids. So speak up. We have questions. You do not have to answer the questions, but they are used as a guide to help in the discussion. So let's go to our groups, and we'll be back at, I'll come back at 9 o'clock. And it is now 8:30. Okay.